Okay, we're going to get started. So good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. It's a beautiful day. My name is Mike Berry. I'm the Executive Director of WASBO, and I'm lucky to be joined today by my co-host and moderator of the chat room. That's John Gahan, Assistant Superintendent for Pewaukee School.
Welcome, everyone.
So if you jumped on early and could hear that little violin concerto that was playing, that was actually the WASBO Chamber Orchestra, and we brought them in specially this morning just so you could hear that. It may have sounded recorded, but it was actually live under the direction of John Stelmacher, our conductor. So next time you see John, thank him for that. Appreciate you joining us today. The purpose of this seminar is to talk about Act 185. We are going to record this presentation, and probably with some heavy editing, and then share it with WASDA and with some other groups. I and John are not muted, at least I hope not. Everybody else is, and we encourage you to use the Q&A chat room function as issues come up that you'd like to share with us. We will answer as many as we can during the time that we're together. Otherwise, we will follow up, obviously, after the live segment has concluded. Special thanks to a number of people. First, the folks at DPI who put this survey together in the first place, and then also some WASBO folks. John Gahan, Beth Sheridan, Brian Adesso, who helped kind of proof this presentation. You should know that there is an Act 185 survey website that DPI maintains if you have the need to go in there and do some research. Okay, so purpose, we express this as a kind of an if-then. And so let's take a look. If we develop a consistent interpretation of the questions and common parameters for the responses, then we'll improve the accuracy and reliability of the data and hopefully provide a more accurate picture of how COVID-19 has affected Wisconsin school districts. That's really the overall goal. So if we're going to do this survey, and we will, we'd like it to really reflect what's truly happened to the school districts during this pandemic. So a little background, what is Act 185? Act 185 is a Wisconsin Act. It was passed into law back on April 15th, which seems like about 100 years ago in pandemic terms. The Act had a lot of things in it beyond K-12. It addressed the healthcare industry. You might remember that it allowed you to pay your property taxes on a different schedule. It had some impacts on unemployment comp and so on. In K-12 specifically, as I recall, it suspended the state report card process for school districts. It put a stop or interrupted the state major assessments, testing protocols. And then it also included this survey, which is what we're all about today. So the key dates here, November 1 is the date by which your school district must complete the survey report. DPI then takes over and has to turn all of that data into a report, which will go to the state legislature by the first of the new year. And remember that, like so much of the rest of your data, this is open or will be open to the public at some point. So the January 1 date is interesting for the report to the legislature in that it's really at the front end of the discussions concerning the 21-23 state budget. And that, of course, will affect schools significantly. So I think it's important that we get this story told and told well and accurately in time for that to have some effect on the 21-23 budget discussions. So there's 22 questions in this, this survey. They're broken into essentially 5 distinct groups. Questions 1 through 10 get at the delivery of instruction during the period of the shutdown or the closure, March 11th to June 30th. That part is followed by 2 questions regarding layoff and reassignment, essentially personnel questions. There are 4 questions about meal program activity during the period in question. There are 2 questions about financial impacts, both for that March to June period and also for current year. And then there are 3 or 4 questions on student transportation. So this is a little unusual, but I think for purposes of today's presentation, we've taken questions 1 through 10 on delivery of instruction and moved them to the back of this slide deck so that we can concentrate a little bit more on the issues that are going to be primarily the responsibility of the business managers in completing this survey. As you probably know, responding to this survey is something of a team effort because it affects multiple areas within your school district. So we're going to start with the areas that are most important or most prevalent for WASBO members. And then as time allows, we will take on the questions about delivery of instruction. Okay, so because we're jumping over questions 1 through 10, we're going to get into this presentation with question 11 as our starting point. And hopefully this question alone will illustrate why we thought it was important to do this live webinar today. Again, like I said at the beginning, we're looking for consistency in the interpretation of the question and accuracy in how we report it. So let's take a look at 11. Report the number of staff by position type who were laid off during the entire period of the public health emergency, March 12 through June 30th. That's how it is written in the DPI survey. That's just a cut and paste. You are offered here 11 categories of position types to report out on, including an other. So here's some of the things that we think are important for everyone to kind of get on the same page about. First, when reporting number of staff by position type, we're interested in headcount, not full-time equivalents. So obviously, if you were to have laid off 2, let's just say, for example, 2 part-time custodians, each 0.5s, you would report that as 2, not as a 1.0. So headcount, not FTE. All of you business managers are familiar with that logic. Okay. Secondly, it doesn't have to be full-time regular employed position. Positions such as coaches and club advisors, seasonal staff, others who would have typically received an employment contract, even if it's an extra duty contract. Thinking here primarily your spring sports, your spring theater and drama. Maybe you bring in some seasonal staff for groundskeeping in the spring. A lot of those things didn't happen during the closure period. And if that's the case, if you did not issue those contracts, that constitutes a layoff, and we want you to report those here. The wording in the question says who were laid off for the entire period of the health emergency. And we had a chance to check behind the scenes with the folks at DPI. And I think it's kind of easily misconstrued. They didn't mean literally that, that layoffs were issued on March 12th. And extended all the way through June 30th. That's not the spirit of the question. The spirit of the question is layoffs which occurred anytime during the entire window, anytime within the entire window, meaning March 12 to June 30. So most school districts, remember, this is This was a 2-week closure at first. So very few school districts were issuing layoffs or taking any other significant personnel actions immediately or for the entire period. So, so hopefully that, that clarification helps. Remember, this pertains to your employees only, your school district employees. That may seem like it goes without saying, but it's very possible that your major contracted services, perhaps a transportation carrier, or perhaps a food service management company, issued layoffs that were in a way related to your school district. That doesn't count. If it's not your employee, you exclude that from your response. Partial layoffs should be included here as well. The example that we offer here is perhaps you had a part-time custodian working 4 hours a day. At some point in this window of time between March and June, you felt it was appropriate to scale that back to 2 hours a day. That is a partial layoff, and that too should be reported here in question 11. So it's a pretty straightforward question on the surface, but as you can see from just these 5 clarifications, there is a need for us to be consistent and uniform in how we interpret and how we respond. Okay?
So Mike, we've got several questions dealing with question 11 on the layoffs here, and I think you answered one of them already with the staff who were reduced. A reduction in an assignment or paying for half of a contract would be a reduction. So that's would be considered like a partial layoff on those. Substitutes, if you're under contract for their days, I would say that if you are contracting for a number of days and they're laid off, they're unable to perform their work, that still would be a layoff if they aren't being utilized.
Thanks, John. Okay, let's jump ahead to question 12, which is similar. It's the second of the 2 personnel questions. So here we go. Report the number of staff by position type who were reassigned to other work. And that's really the key phrase here. Reassigned to other work outside their usual position and assignment during the public health emergency. Again, here defined as March 12th through June 30th. So again, you have 11 categories of position type from which to choose. Again, respond in headcount format as opposed to FTE. We understand that almost all of your reassignment activity at the school districts during this period were considered to be temporary and in some ways informal. It seems that it's unlikely, we believe, to find school districts wherein the individual contract was modified or where a WUFAR coding adjustment was made. Those are not necessary for what we're trying to get at. Even if the transfer or the reassignment was temporary and informal, it still matters and it's still what we're reporting out on. In the approach to this question, the description here is that we're trying to capture the headcount reassigned from. So it's not a from and to format. Maybe this is best explained with an example. And the example might be that you had 4 buildings and grounds employees that were reassigned to food service, just as an example. In completing this question, you'd be designating the 4 people as being reassigned to other work in the buildings and grounds line in this response. You would not need to go into the food service line and then report for coming in. Okay, so think of it as reassigned from. It doesn't have to have a matching from and to. To keep it simple, just reassigned from. The phrase other work outside of usual would not include certain types of minor adjustments in work. So for example, if the head custodian of the middle school was moved over to the high school during this period, that's still custodial work. That's not considered, for purposes of this question, a reassigned to other work. For the most part, teaching is teaching, even if there were slight changes in the nature of the assignment. For paraprofessionals, in most cases, instead of necessarily being in the classroom helping, they might have been helping online. That again is not reassigned to other work. We're looking for those instances where employees were reassigned from one of these categories to another. Okay.
Quick, two questions that came up in the chat and the Q&A on this. Number one, would you count any of the people in these reassigned or laid off numbers if they still continue to be paid their full wages through the entire time? And I would suggest that you would not include them because they did not take a reduction in pay from this process. And then the duplication, I would be cautious on a duplication of people. So if you had a staff member who maybe laid off and also coached a sport, that you don't count them twice in the numbers.
Thanks, John. Okay, let's move on to questions. Questions 13, 14, 15, and 16 are basically meal program questions. And these are a little more straightforward and don't require quite as much context for the answers. And they're very similar. So we'll move through these rather quickly. How many breakfasts were provided during the public health emergency? Again, March to June, to each of the USDA child nutrition programs listed below. And not all of them are listed below. Use the same numbers that were reported for federal claims. So I think the key here is that this question is not asking you to conjure up new data. This is calling for previously reported data from your federal claims. Your June, May, and April claims should be pretty straightforward. You should be able to find this information. Your March claim might be a little more complicated in that a lot of districts are switching categories in March because the closure period began March 12th. So again, this is previously reported data. You should be able to find it. Most of the districts seem to switch either into summer food service or the seamless summer option. And districts made those switches at different times, right? Some earlier, some later. Some are waiting for guidance as to what they could, when or if they could use the summer food service program. So the key here is to go back to your claims data and simply cut and paste those figures. The lunch program is essentially the same question, right? And then finally, question 15, the dinner program, which is not as commonly found around the state. It's again, essentially the same question. Asking you to go back and look at your previously reported claims data and replicate that here on this survey, okay? The final of the food service questions is more narrative in nature. It's about how. How were meals provided to pupils during the public health emergency? And they offer you an example about meals being delivered to students or offered for pickup. The key thing here is that there was amazing work done by school districts across the state. Amazing creativity and problem solving. And here is an opportunity through this survey and through this narrative question to tell your story. And go ahead and tell it, because many of these stories are remarkable and a real success. It might be that you had multiple strategies for how you got meals to students. Go ahead and list them all and describe them all. There's no need to hold back in telling your story. Remember that your primary audience here is the state legislature, and they should know the good work that was done across the state. Okay, John, are we good to move ahead?
Yes.
Okay, so on to two of the more sort of complex questions in the survey. Questions 17 and 18 are financial expenditure questions, and we're going to take a little bit of time on these two. Yeah, I think it's super important that we get this right. One of the potential benefits of the time that you invest in this survey is that you'll have an opportunity to explain and describe what happened in your district and its financial impact, both for the year just ended, 1920, and for 2021. And remember, there are, in many different audiences that are interested in K-12, there is the perception, perhaps the misperception, that districts saved tremendous amounts of money during the closure period. I don't think that's what is actually, I don't think that the data really supports that. And here's a chance for us to get at that and get the story told accurately. So the first question deals with the expenditures in each of the following categories, and you'll see those below: increased or reduced due to the public health emergency, again, March through June, compared to what was projected on or before March 11, 2020, for the remainder of the 1920 school year budget before the public health emergency began. In other words, we're looking back at last year, and we're comparing the budget that you had for last year, essentially, versus the actual for last year, with a bit of a twist, and we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so this is focused on last year. The categories that are offered here are not everything. It's these particular areas: utilities, transportation, food service, personnel, contract terminations, and other. So let's unpack this a little bit. First, this is a very common business manager question. Is this general fund only? Is it operating funds only, meaning general and special ed, or is it all funds? And the answer here is it's all funds across the entire organization. Secondly, as the categories that are offered suggest, the survey is probing for certain pieces of data about expenditure increases or decreases. It's not asking you to tie these 6 categories out against your total budget variance for the year. I think all of us who do the budget reports, the annual reports, the September to January enrollment reconciliations, you want to tie this out, and it won't. They're not asking you to. They're asking you for samples of certain pieces of data as listed here. So no need to make these 6 bullets somehow total your budget variance. Next, your budget variance for any of these categories may be attributed to factors other than COVID-19 or are mixed in with COVID-19. The most common example of this would be on like utilities, for example. You may have been trending under budget due to favorable conditions in the winter. And you may have known as late as March 1st that you were going to be $50,000 under budget on utilities. That may have been where you thought you were. And then, as it turned out, June 30th, you were under not 50,000, but 100,000. And in that case, the answer that we're seeking is the part that is attributed to COVID-19. Okay, it's the $50,000 additional savings in this example that was related to the closure period. I hope that makes sense. You have to sort of sort through what your budget variance is and identify that subset that is related to COVID-19. Yeah, okay. And utilities, for example, as long as we're on that, I think the common definition across the state would be water, sewer, gas, and electric. Food service is an interesting one. Many districts will report that they saw an increase in expenditures for food service. Some will report a decrease in expenditures for food service. I think it really depends on the volumes that were maintained or not maintained during the closure period, and also extra labor and extra costs associated with distribution of meals and so on. So you are to report here, focus narrowly on the expenditure side of the question. Expenditures increased or decreased. However, we would strongly encourage you to take a look at or take advantage of the opportunity to provide a narrative explanation, provide a little context. For example, if your expenditures decreased substantially, it might be important to mention that your revenues decreased substantially as well. The question asks you to address expenditures, and that's what you have to do, and you have to stick with that explanation, expenditures, but then put in some context. And it might be good to talk about how the total picture came out altogether in an additive paragraph or something like that.
As Mike mentioned in this, as we started going through it right from the start, this is really the opportunity to tell your story. And in 17 and 18, this is where it becomes key. And the question is very specific. You said a couple of times, it's really focused on the expenditures that you've increased or reduced. But that other category is the one where you can tell your story about the impact. And so take advantage of that one.
Yeah. The personnel category here is complex. There's all kinds of moving pieces here with personnel, both decreases and increases. Just from the districts that we've talked to across the state, the decreases in personnel expenditures where they occurred were typically in areas like the spring coaching and extracurricular contracts that we talked about earlier. Also, things that were directly related to in-person student supervision, crossing guards, playground supervisors, in some cases, decreases in custodial staffing. You're familiar with all of those. On the increase side, districts reported increases in nursing services, health room, no doubt for planning and communication related to COVID. Not uncommon to see lots of overtime in IT staff, technology staff. Also, increases in guidance counselor time, trying to plan and adjust for all the changes related to the instructional side of the program. So lots of other examples as well. It takes some time with this and really try to identify as many different instances as you can. It'll help tell a more complete story. Contract terminations, other than those noted above, it seems like most districts, if they have these, their big contract terminations would be in the area of maybe a contracted transportation or a contracted food service. But this question asks for operations other than those noted above. And as you see, we've already dealt with transportation and food service. So maybe, just maybe some of the examples that you might go looking for here would be if you had let's just say, for example, a $5,000 professional development presenter, speaker coming into your district for an end of the year activity, and you decided not to go ahead with that. That would be a contract termination. Maybe you have like one of those sports trainer contracts with like an orthopedic firm or something, and you said, well, we're not having spring, so we're just going to eliminate that contract. That would be another example. So find those to the extent that you can and identify them. And then lastly, one of the items, significant items or areas of activity that's not captured here in 17 is what happened on the instructional side, non-personnel. And remember that this survey was originally sort of conceived by the legislature back in probably late March, early April, and became law April 15th. And the DPI folks were working on it after that. I think that we've all become more aware of what happened on the instructional side. And I think that if we're going to report expenditure increases and decreases during the health emergency, it might be helpful to use the other category here to focus on the instructional materials, the technology that you may have, went out and bought 200 Chromebooks, or the hotspots, or other expenditures related to supporting a one-to-one or near one-to-one environment. Maybe you were running your copier around the clock, producing materials, instructional materials for your primary grades. Maybe manipulative sets and book sets that were distributed to students. I think if we don't tell the instructional story here in question 17, we may have missed an opportunity. So strongly encourage you to look at that instructional and technology, those two combined areas, and try to tell the story as best you can using the other category that's provided. And of course, you have the opportunity to add description as well.
So a couple of specific questions on here, one related to transportation, and the way just that the survey question is worded, that it's looking beyond just day-to-day transportation, adding extracurricular, and I think it would be fair then to add your transportation cost in general. Those parent contracts, the taxis, all those other items, that's all part of transportation.
And that would include fuel if your contract is created that way, yes? Okay, so question 17 is important. We encourage you to take your time with it and provide as much detail and context as you can. Remember, you are doing this in a context where a lot of folks think that you saved extraordinary amounts of money, and this might be a chance to correct some misperceptions out there.
This has come up a couple of times in the chat now too, about legal expenses and consulting fees as you transitioned into the pandemic mode and how to operate under that. Definitely, I think those fit under that other category and are worth addressing.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to move ahead to question 18. which is another one of these more challenging financial questions in the survey. This is sort of the current year version of question 17. So question 18, estimate the amounts by which expenditures in each of the following categories are planned or anticipated to increase or decrease in 2021 compared to what would have been planned or anticipated had there not been a public health emergency. So in a way, this is the budget that you normally would have had for 2021 versus the budget that you sort of adapted to more accurately reflect what you plan or anticipate for 2021. I'm trying to measure the difference, right? The categories that are offered for your response are the same as the ones that we just saw in question 17, although the issues here, because we're dealing with the current year, are a little bit different. So the first one of which is something we didn't have to deal with in the prior question. And that is, would you or should you assume that the pandemic conditions under which we are operating are going to extend through, well, when? January 1, March 1? We will lose validity in our responses if districts are choosing different end dates. And let's face it, no one really knows. So we recommend strongly that everybody who does this survey simply stipulate to the idea that you're going to be operating as you are through June 30th of 2021, through the whole year. Now, we understand that in many cases you're going to be shifting back and forth, right? Between some in-person element and back to virtual, and over to hybrid and back to virtual, depending on local conditions. So that makes this question difficult to answer. Just do your best and work with the idea that this is going on all year. Second point, the answers that you provide could vary substantially from a similar sized school district based on your instructional delivery model, right? So just because you are a similarly sized district doesn't necessarily mean that your budget impact is going to be the same or similar to a same size district. If you, for example, opened up in person from day one and have maintained that throughout and plan to continue that, then odds are that your transportation budget is likely to be the same as it was last year or more due to some physical distancing and extra routes. On the other hand, if your similarly sized district on another part of the state opened up in virtual and has no busing and it plans to stay in virtual for a while, they're going to be reporting transportation costs that are going down. Right? So just because you're the same size district doesn't mean you have to have the same answer. All right, so the answers will vary, and that's okay. Okay, so on food service, again, that's very similar to the last answer in 17. They're asking about expenditures. We encourage you to write the story there and explain that, well, sure, food service expenditures are going up or down, but don't forget, we also have a revenue component and we have sort of a net component. So make sure you talk about that. Your personnel piece, again, similar to what we said in 17. I think here, the districts that are in hybrid seem to have significant increases in personnel. Districts that are adjusting class sizes in order to attain a desirable physical distancing within classrooms are seeing personnel increases. Districts have loaded up in health room and health room helpers, and lots of other areas. Decreases, it depends, right? If you employ your own bus fleet and you're not in a, and you are in a virtual, you may have decreases for transportation related personnel. Again, there's a whole mixed bag there. You have to work through each category and really think it through. Contract terminations, if you have them, You may have had a significant CISA contract for some service that you've decided to completely forego under these conditions. That's where you would report it. And then other. Now, other in this instance is a significant point for us. As you're reporting what's going on for 2021, the question that's presented does an excellent job on the expenditure side, helps you, guides you through, but it does not address what is probably your most significant challenge this year, which is the revenue side of your 2021 budget. You've all just done your third Friday counts, so you know what's going on, right? If you are losing significant enrollment this year, then your challenge, your financial challenge, is most likely to be a combination of revenue losses and expenditure increases. So we think it's super important for the legislature to understand that part of the equation. So we've talked behind the scenes with business managers, with DPI folks, and try to get a handle on how to address this. And here's what we're recommending. We strongly encourage this. This will work if everyone buys into it. Using the other category, which is provided in question 18, use this as your opportunity with narrative explanation to address what's happening on the revenue side, right? Without that piece of the picture, we're not really telling the legislature and the state what's happening in your school district. Now, here's a little structure to help do that. You report a single number and other, 3 components to it. The first, and these are the 3 major areas of revenue loss in school districts. First, the change in your per pupil categorical aid versus your original budget expectation. If this categorical aid is $742 a pupil, take a look at your revenue limit line 6. That's where your enrollment change is reported, and do the math. The second component, in addition to the categorical aid loss, which you will feel this year, is the change in revenue limit authority versus what you originally budgeted. That's your revenue limit line 11 change, what you would have expected for 2021 and what you're actually going to have for 2021. Now, we should point out here that there is a revenue limit, a declining revenue exemption that allows you to sort of escape the immediate impact of the loss of revenue limit authority, but it gets you in the second year. It gets you eventually. So, so that's not a reason to skip that answer. We think go ahead and say it. Our revenue limit authority is going to decrease by X. That's like the second component of revenue loss. And then a third is you may have, and this will vary across the state, you may have other sources of revenue that are going to be in significant shortfall this year. Obvious examples would be gate receipts or ticket sales for athletic events, maybe student fees as well. So we're strongly encouraging respondents to this survey to take some time on question 18 in the other category and calculate these 3 elements of revenue loss and report it with context. That will all be channeled into DPI. They'll have all of November and December to sort through it and work with that information and decide how they want to present that in their report to the legislature. Without it, you're only telling a portion of your story. John, I'm going to pause there. Did you have any comment?
Yeah, a couple of things that popped up through the chat on here. Again, from the start, we talked about this is an all funds look. So if you're responding to personnel, yes, your food service would be included in those numbers if you had reductions in costs that were coming from operations. Transportation, again, is your transportation a contracted service or is it done in-house? And that will determine where you'll record those expenses and those costs. And the last set of questions on here really dives into that transportation to get more specific on that. When it comes to expenditures, again, this is not looking at the revenue side. This is looking at the expenditure side. So a couple of questions about CARES Act and the implications of the response to that. This is asking about what expenses were reduced or expenses were incurred. You can use the other category for projected revenues that you would receive from the CARES Act, and that may be a good comparison to show how those expenses that are incurred compare to what you're receiving for potential funding.
Thanks. I think the overall spirit of this is to provide DPI with as much information as you can, with context, and and allow DPI folks to kind of sift it and sort it and reorganize it. If you don't include it in the survey, then you've pretty much given up the opportunity to tell the story. Thanks. John just referenced some transportation questions that are on the survey, and those are coming up here. These are pretty straightforward, but there's a couple of key things we want to say about it. Remember, again, this is the context of March and April, when there was a lot of sort of uncertainty about how to pay your transportation contractor, what was fair, what did how is all that going to get resolved? So that's showing up here in this survey. So first question, who provides the daily transportation? Either district, the contractor, or a combination. The second question is, did you and your contractor for daily transportation to and from school reach an agreement, an addendum, or a contract revision on payments during that public health emergency? It's a yes or no. If you have an ongoing, unresolved issue with your contractor, go ahead and say that, right? In fact, it's probably safest for you to say, we have an open issue and it's not resolved, okay? And if it's a significant dispute, you might want to check with your legal counsel. What did your original transportation contract say in 1920 regarding payment on days when school is closed in lieu of payment for daily transportation? I think we all found out that this contract language had all sorts of different versions and forms across the state. And in many cases, the contracts were silent on this issue. So if you had clear language, you can report it here. If you had no language, you can report that as well. And lastly, what did you actually pay? Essentially, how was this all resolved? Again, lots of different situations across the state. Not everybody has this resolved. If you are one of those districts, again, you're probably working with your legal counsel. Say it's unresolved. Don't go any further than you have to on that. Most commonly, deals were worked out. Agreements and addendums were worked out whereby the district paid the contractor, you've seen these percentages, 50, 60, 70, 80% of what normally would have been paid. And that was typically mutually agreed upon. And those numbers have varied across the state. So those are your 4 big transportation questions. John, are we good?
Good.
Okay. Okay, so as you might remember from the beginning, we jumped over the first 10 questions of this survey because they really get at the mechanics of virtual instruction. Your response on this survey is going to be a combination of your financial input and operational input, and somebody from your instructional side who will be addressing or help you address questions 1 through 10. So as much as John and I like doing this webinar, we have to admit that an even better version of this is available for you. Aaron Fath at DPI, who did a presentation for WASBO back in August, and is one of the authors of this survey instrument and has been living in this much deeper than the rest of us. Aaron did a nice 1 hour presentation. I think it's actually a little under an hour. So if you're looking for more context and certainly a smoother delivery, the link is there. It's a YouTube link. And Aaron comments a little bit more than we will about the virtual instruction side. But since we do have a couple of minutes, I want to take a quick look at it and then we'll wrap up. So question 1 is simple yes, no. Did you implement virtual instruction during the emergency? I think that the overwhelming majority of districts will answer yes, some will answer no, and if it's no, they give you reasons. The question is structured to guide you through an explanation of the if not. In fact, for questions 1 through 10, there's a ton of structure that the respondents can use, much more so than on the financial side, I think. So these are, in a way, kind of safer and easier questions for uniformity of response. Question 2, in which grades was virtual instruction implemented? Some grades did not, or some districts did not do this, for example, in their primary grades. The process, what steps were required? This is literally a situation where DPI has laid out a whole series of steps, and the districts can simply designate the examples that are provided, and then use the last box to identify other steps as well. Question 4, what do you recommend as best practices for transitioning to and from? Again, this is where you're going to be working with your superintendent, your district administrator, your director of instruction, and principals to get input on question 4. Question 5, describe the challenges or barriers related to implementing virtual. Again, there's a ton of great context already provided by the DPI authors of this survey. So the respondents can almost use a checklist approach to this and then fill in the other challenges box as well if there's anything new to add. And you can see just from the examples that are provided, it seems that there were plenty of challenges or barriers to virtual instruction. Question 6 goes in a little bit different direction. Did the district implement non-digital remote instruction? And there are examples offered, and you can explain how you did or did not use that approach. Which grades did that structure apply to? Finally, we're up to question 8. Again, what was your process for non-digital? These are kind of parallel questions to the digital questions that we just saw. And question 9, I would not recommend that anybody wing this unless you, especially if you're on the operational and financial side. This is a tough question. This needs some significant input from your instructional folks. What is the percentage of instructional or curricular coverage that happened during the closure period, and actually the whole year, including the closure period. So make sure you get some help on that question. And then question 10 is any other information type of question. So there are additional resources available to you. Don't forget that DPI has an Act 185 survey webpage. You can see the link there. Don't forget about Aaron's excellent YouTube video, which is available to you through this presentation. If you're really interested in looking at the text of Act 185, you can do that and its summary. And your contacts at DPI are the very talented Aaron Fath and the equally talented Dan Bush, who again have been working on this for quite some time. And again, we thank them for their help. And we thank you for participating in this webinar. Remember, your response to DPI is due on November 1. So with that, John, any closing comments?
Just want to thank everybody for the questions and for the thoughtfulness that went into this. While we can't address the specific questions that are there just to the time frames. We didn't want to get into the weeds with this presentation. It was more about setting a tone and setting a pattern for how the responses are. And so while there are specific questions hanging out there yet, the great resources that are on the second last slide will be able to really provide you additional direction.
Okay, great. And I hope that everybody gets a chance today and this week to take advantage of this spectacular fall weather. If you spend all of your days on Zoom calls, as many of us do, great opportunity this week to get outside and enjoy some classic Wisconsin fall weather. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you down the road.